Now just going to spend a few minutes just thinking a bit more about footwear. We talked about footwear earlier, just considering really the overall shape of your shoe choices. But I think we just wanted to spend a little bit more time exploring that a bit further now. I think from the start it's important to think about your footwear in terms of what you're going to be doing with your feet on that particular day. So there's going to be certain types of footwear that you might use if you're indoors or you're walking on the level. But if you're going outside and you're on harder pavements and a lot of concrete floors, for instance, in the workplace, or you're on ground that undulates, then your footwear needs are going to be slightly different in order to protect your feet. If you have a look at the NRAS website, there's a whole section there that's been put together by the team at the University of Salford in Manchester, and there's particular information there about footwear which I'd suggest you have a look at. There's also AR UK, for instance. They provide a booklet on footwear. We've got an example here which you can have a look at in a moment. And we've done our own version as well, so there's quite a bit of information out there. When you think about a shoe, I think the first thing to consider is its weight, because you probably find that during the day you actually get quite tired and your legs are going to be affected by heavy things on the end. And these are just two different sole units. We've got three of them there, but if you compare the weights of those, and that's just the different material choices. So sometimes people will buy very light shoes and then they'll take them to be repaired, and actually the repairer will have to put on a harder composite unit, and it actually really makes your footwear heavy. So that's the first thing to think about. I think the other thing to think about then is also the shape of your foot. So you want the shape of the front of your shoe or boot to really match up quite closely with the shape of the front of your foot as much as possible. And I appreciate for some people that becomes very difficult. We'll come on to that in a moment. We saw a slide earlier when Kim was talking about, and it showed a second toe that was hammered, and it made the front of the foot quite deep as a result. So it's not just about thinking about width of the front, it's also thinking about the depth of the shoe box. If you've got a very broad foot and you put that into the shoe and it stretches the shoe, and we've got a slide to show you in a moment, it also makes a difference. So yeah, I was saying that if you've got a foot that is quite broad, and you put that in the shoe, and you've also got a toe that sticks up, that will draw the upper down because you're stretching the material one way, it will pull it down in the other direction. So it's these sort of things to think about. Also, where you've got stitching, those sort of issues can make a difference. If you've got problems with the back part of your foot, so things like problems with this subtalar joint, that's that joint underneath the ankle joint, or the posterior tibial tendon problems Kim was talking about, then maybe a boot is going to be better than a shoe because it's going to provide more stability. So it's those are kind of things to consider. Also fastenings. If you've got difficulty with your hands, are you better with a buckle or Velcro than laces? So it's all these variables. That kind of brings back really to some of the stuff that Sadie was talking about, joint protection. And one of the benefits of footwear provision footwear advice is around providing protection to joints that are vulnerable. Because you've got an inflammatory arthritis, that makes the tissues a little bit more lax, which means that they're more easily deformed by loads. And that's a big difference between our hands and our feet, isn't it? That actually, when you look at the bony shapes and stuff, they're very similar, but we put our full body weight through our foot. If you've got problems with your walking, or if you're in pain, you tend to be walking slower, so you're going to actually put more load for a longer period of time through a structure that's vulnerable. Whereas if you can walk at a reasonable pace, then the actual load times are a lot shorter. So it makes a difference in terms of joint protection. Footwear can also help with relieving pain. So for instance, if you've got a foot where it's very difficult to turn your foot inwards and outwards because there's an arthritic process that's damaged that joint and that movement is painful, you might use a boot then that stabilises that joint, stops the movement alongside an insole. Quite often we'd use maybe deeper insoles, something like that in this instance. And that's kind of extremely deep, but it kind of makes the point. Just to provide that stability, that joint protection, which then aids pain relief. And all that is, if you take away the pain, on the whole, people tend to be more mobile. There's also the whole issue of falls prevention, and falling is something that happens, if you look at the population, people fall over, unfortunately. Sometimes people, we just have an accident, I've fallen over, we've all fallen over, but sometimes people, because of their health issues, are falling over. But we do know also that foot problems will have an impact on falling, and some people with particular foot problems are more likely to fall. And if you've got an inflammatory arthritis, you may also have osteoporosis, so that makes you more vulnerable to fractures as a result of falling. So this whole joint stability, making people more comfortable, improving their mobility, has an impact through on falls as well. Your footwear choices are really important in terms of preventing falling. So if you are barefoot or in slippers, it's something like a 20-fold increase in your risk of falling. So even indoors, try and wear stable footwear that is really well fastened to your foot. And again, think about, if you're outside, what sort of terrain you're going to be, what activity you're going to be doing to try and make you more stable. And that's kind of also in the context of other walking aids that if people need that. And we've also just talked a little bit about wound and ulcer prevention and actually healing wounds and ulcers, and footwear choices, various insoles, they're very much a big part of that picture of actually getting somebody's foot back to being intact and infection-free. The picture on the corner there really shows the difference, and then going back to this whole thing of stable footwear versus unstable footwear. And that's quite an old picture, but I think it makes the point that it really does make a big difference in keeping people safe. Just to say, when you're looking at particular examples of where the foot will have changed shape and it's maybe become very broad, but you've also got the situation where you've actually got a very deep toe box needed because the depth of that foot from the top of that toe to the ball of the foot has been exaggerated or has been enlarged by that deformity. Then it's really important to try and accommodate everything. And as you can see on that far right picture, again, it's that little toe that's just got that tissue damage that we know underneath it, because that change in colour, there's something happening there. Really important to think about the toe box, the width of the toe box, but also is there any seams that might stop the material giving? Is it a material that's going to give anyway? So some of the sort of like the suede or the nubuck materials will give better than having a firm leather. So one thing to do when thinking about choosing your footwear is to consider the material. So you want a softer material in the front part that's going to adapt to the shape of the front of your foot, but without any particular seams over areas that are vulnerable. But you may be better with a more firmer material that makes up the back section, particularly if you're going for a boot as well. I think it's helpful to just think a little bit about provided footwear. And the reality is, for some people, their foot changes in shape to the point where it becomes very difficult to go to a commercial shoe shop and buy something. Or they come to see a podiatrist like myself, and we will be trying to manage their foot problem, but we require to put an insole inside the shoe. So something like this has only got about a 4mm cushioning in the front part, but sometimes we need 5, 6, 7mm, and you're not going to be able to get that into a commercial shoe and get the foot in as well. Or the risk is, if you do, you push it in and then you cause problems elsewhere. So then it's those scenarios, and particularly around problems with the tissue and the tissue breaking down or ulcerating, that we will then get into provided footwear. And this is just another example of the sort of thing we might put in a shoe. But it does need accommodating, and so that's again an example of when we'll get into providing footwear.
Do you have somebody who will make shoes for you? Jimmy Choo probably doesn't do what we need. So do you have a factory that does them?
Yeah, what will happen within the NHS is that most general hospitals will have attached to them an orthotics service. So an orthotics service is a service that provides things like footwears, insoles, but it will do, say, collars for necks, also any sort of device that needs adding externally to the body to protect it, so splints, all that sort of stuff. And so that's a way of accessing that type of service. What happens here locally is that there is an orthotic service attached to the general hospital, but within the rheumatology service we have a specialist footwear clinic, and there you have a podiatrist working with a shoe fitter in this instance. Around the country the models vary. Sometimes you'll have an orthotist working on their own. You may have a podiatrist who's been trained to provide footwear. There's lots of models, but yes, you should be able to access some type of footwear provision within the NHS if you have a clinical need for that.
So where you say sometimes the patient will need an orthotic that's so deep that you can't then get your foot in the shoe. Yeah. Does your contact, do they make a bigger shoe, a deeper shoe?
Yes.
You actually do that?
It depends what you need. But yeah, if you're providing part of providing any sort of device like this is that you've got to get it into the shoe. And that's quite often a compromise clinically, because we are working with a footwear that somebody's happy with, and so we try and work with that. So your choice of materials will maybe depend on how much space you've got to work with. So some of the lightweight, very flexible materials are relatively bulky, whereas others, the carbon fibres, are very thin and slimline in terms of putting them into footwear. But the crux sometimes comes when you get to the ball of the foot area, which is usually an area that we need to put some cushioning under. And the more cushioning you tend to get, the more comfort you get. But then that flips back to the shoe choice as well. So a lot of shoe choices, if you have a soft sole unit, then that will provide cushioning as well between the ground and the foot. So it's about thinking about the sole unit, not just what you're putting inside the shoe. And I think that those examples of soling material are passed around. The heavy one is a hard, resilient material that won't provide any shock absorbing or shock attenuation for your foot, whereas the other one is very light and it will really cushion your foot in relation to the ground. The downside is it will tend to break down and collapse more quickly and need repairing more often. Here we've got some examples from our footwear clinic locally where I work with a shoe fitter. This is Alan Tonkin, and he's a shoe fitter who comes from Clark's originally, and he's worked in footwear all his working life, and he only works now with people with inflammatory arthritis. Here he's doing his measuring, you can see on the picture on the left, and these are some of the footwear that actually comes out through that clinic. And I think when you're providing footwear, whilst there are clinically we are trying to achieve particular things, we also try to be sensitive to what people are happy to wear as well. I think that's a balance that we try to strive to. But you can see some of the sort of styles there that's available, reflecting really people's needs and what they're able to manage in terms of hands and Velcro or laces and that sort of thing.
Can you tell us how costly it is to have your shoes made by your department?
I think when it comes to the cost of footwear provision, it varies because everybody's footwear is individual to them, and footwear on the whole is being made bespoke to that person to some level or other. So there is a range from shoes that you can order an extra width and extra depth, and that can become almost off the shelf from a specialist factory, through to shoes that they will need to adapt and build around adapted lasts in order to meet your need. In some cases they may have to make a last. So those stages have different costs. Certainly the footwear that we're providing, I think, is in a range of $320 up to $380. But it will vary depending on manufacturers, and it will vary considerably on individuals' needs. And obviously boots cost more than shoes.
Thank you.
Just a few more pictures of sort of different styles. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier about trying to have footwear that reflects what you're doing. So it might be that somebody has a pair of shoes but also has a pair of boots which covers their activity, or they have a trainer style pair of footwear and more sort of functional pair of shoes as well alongside that. So it really depends on the individual needs. I put the picture in on the right, and this lady kindly sent this to me just last week, and she obviously has particular difficulties with her mobility, but she also has very specific footwear needs in order to protect her feet. And she's wearing the pair that she's just received, and she's dressed to match, and she's showing her previous pair as well. So she seems very happy with what we've been able to do for her. I think just before we close, just run through some of the areas where you can get useful information. And obviously, the NRAS website and their helpline is a good place in terms of getting advice and guidance. Arthritis Research UK provide a lot of patient information. And we've got an example here of their book about feet and footwear and arthritis. And you can go to their website. You can just view these, or you can download them to print. There's information there about all the rheumatology conditions, and also a lot of information about specific problems. I've put on there also the College of Podiatry. So that's the Society of Chiropodists and Podiatrists website. And at that website you can actually find out information about general foot problems, not necessarily specific to rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory arthritis, but more sort of the general population. But there is also, if you're looking to find somebody in private practice to go and see in terms of your feet and foot care, then they actually provide that facility through that website. We've put on there also the Health and Care Professions Council, the HCPC website, and they are the body that, in effect, they regulate us in ourselves, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, and the other care and social care professions. On that website, there's a facility to put in the name of the person you're seeing in terms of your foot care provision, and you can just confirm that they are HCPC registered, which is quite a useful facility to have there. So just before we close, during the session we've considered a number of issues. We've looked at the foot problems that people with inflammatory arthritis have. We've kind of given the background to sort of foot problems, that they are something that crop up in the general population as well, but if you've got an inflammatory arthritis, then those problems can be more significant and maybe need managing in a slightly different way. We've talked a bit about medication, and then gone on to sort of think about the sort of things you might want to think about yourself in terms of making sure your feet stay safe, but what is appropriate for you to deal with yourself and what you need to go and get help about. We've then looked at some specific problems and how they can be managed, and we've also talked a little bit about footwear before considering where to get help, not just in terms of online resources, but getting access to health professionals.